Okay, let me transition now to Johnson City, because now there are investments by the state, by using, I think, some federal money, as you guys know, from the CDBG program, and also the university. So what do you think is the potential impact of all of this? The university, the state, sources of revenue that are going into a relatively small area.
Sure, and that's really important, is to maximize the investment in a relatively small footprint, because it makes a significant difference. Your dollars go a lot further, I think, if you avoid trying to stretch them out over too large an area. But certainly, once the announcement came from the university about the pharmaceutical school, I think that really had a big impact on other developers seeing the opportunities that were there. The Sunrise development for housing with some mixed uses on the first floor, I think, was a first step in that. And you've seen subsequent announcements for the Victory Building and some of the other older Endicott Johnson properties that are now being looked at for redevelopment purposes, as opposed to just outright demolition in some cases.
And I think as an example from the university side is taking the old box factory, and that's going to be the nursing school. And
right.
There's work going there as well. Let me ask you, what are the significant changes during this revitalization? What are the challenges to the 3I districts? Obviously, we're working in Johnson City, but you have Endicott under your fold.
Well, I mean, certainly the funding that's being injected into both of the traditional downtowns and both of the incorporated villages is really a significant achievement, and I think it's going to do wonders, especially in the village of Endicott. Johnson City has seen the investments from the university and other state funding and some of our CDBG money going in to do infrastructure improvements, but Endicott, faces a little bit different challenge because they're a little bit too far from the university to really benefit from any student housing types of redevelopment. So they have to find a different path to revitalizing their downtown than Johnson City has faced. So I know that there's some plans on the board for some hotel development, and they're looking at obviously looking at renovating some of the second and third floors in those buildings for residential uses. But they have different challenges, and I think Endicott has a little bit more work to do than Johnson City does right now.
Okay. Kevin, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, one of the things I was curious about, since you've been here, for a couple decades or more, what do you think, maybe 10, 20 years from now, do you think, what do you kind of foresee, happening in that, downtown Johnson City area? What's your kind of prediction if you had to?
Well, I think the future is pretty bright for Johnson City in particular because of the state investments. But you have to remember, too, that, cities and communities in the Northeast and the Midwest that were developed during the peak growth periods in the country, I think face a little bit more of a challenge because every new use that you have takes place at the expense of a previous use. So we have a lot more money to spend on doing things like demolition, which is not cheap these days, when you have to do asbestos removal and lead and all the other things you have to worry about. But certainly the infrastructure needs to be addressed as well, and we've been trying to do that with some of our block grant money and other funds that we receive through the disaster recovery program. So we're looking to hopefully keep pace with the new development and upgrading the infrastructure. But I think, more importantly, John mentioned before the vacant parcel that's next to the new pharmacy school possibly being used for research and development. But infrastructure will play a pretty big role in that, because if you're going to get into any types of pharmaceutical manufacturing at some point, we're going to need to upgrade the infrastructure in terms of sewage treatment so that we have the ability to process any effluents that comes out of a manufacturing facility. So that might involve creating small package plants to pre-treat some of that effluents before it goes into and over to the Johnson City Binghamton Joint Sewage Treatment Plant. So there's some things we need to look at down the road. But my hope is that there will be a continued pronounced investment in infrastructure in that area.
Good.
Okay, and I have a question for both of you, Sarah. We'll start with you, or you can both talk simultaneously. But you've been with us since we started the story map. You've now reviewed some of the recent stuff. What is in there that you think is useful, and what would you suggest we add to it?
I think for me, one of my biggest concerns is tracking the change in the rent. You know, we run our Section 8 program, and I know we've heard some rumblings from tenants, you know, wondering about how it's going to affect them, how their rent is going to change, if they need to leave Johnson City and move elsewhere. I think that would be important to track and to see the changes that the new housing developments are going to have, because we have such a lack of affordable housing stock, and it's all aging. Seeing that change is going to be something that I think is going to be useful to us moving forward and tracking that throughout the years.
Let me throw a question back at you. If you were monitoring this, how would you go about monitoring those who are being displaced or pushed out?
How would I monitor it?
Or what would you suggest if you, just if you were involved and you were suggesting, for example, to me, you know, what would you do? What would you suggest?
I mean, you've already done surveys. But your surveys were mostly just to students, right?
For the rents, yes.
For the rent.
But one of the challenges will be getting people that you can reach, that you want to get a hold of now as baseline and follow through. That sounds like a great idea, and it is, but where do you start?
That's a good question. I don't know if you have any ideas on how they would be able to track that.
Well, the survey that you did, I think, might possibly be expanded to include people other than just those that are students. And I think you could also get some information through the Department of Social Services on what type of rents they may be paying for units in those areas. We can certainly provide you with some of the rents that we pay in and around that area. But
that would be a big help.
It's interesting that especially with the Sunrise development that's taken place, we've actually had some of our Section 8 clients relocate to that building already. One of the primary reasons is that for people that are getting older, that have some mobility issues perhaps, there are a number of units that were put into that complex that are fully handicap accessible. I don't know if you've had a chance to tour the building, but it's they've done a lot of good work in increasing accessibility, and I think that in some cases, I think for our clientele, they have more choices now than they did previously. It's very difficult to find handicap accessible units in this community at an affordable rental price.
Anecdotally speaking, a number of our students have told us now that when they're going there asking what's the availability of apartments and pricing and whatnot, they're being told that they have to hold a number of these open for people, and so they're not taking their applications.
That's correct, and that has to do with the funding sources for some of these redevelopment applications. There's a percentage mix that has to be set aside for people that are making under 50% of median income, and it really depends on what funding source they're using. For instance, the low-income housing tax credits that were used for a portion of the financing for that building did in fact put some parameters in place for how many of those units needed to be set aside.
Good. So let me come back to story map. What did you see, and I know some of this you just saw for the first time, but what did you see you thought was useful? If you're a planner, is there stuff in there that say, hey, we can use that, or it's informative in this way or that way?
Well, I think having the the lot by lot survey where you have not only the aerial footage, but you have the individual photographs of the storefronts or the residential uses, that's extremely helpful. And also the walkability portion of the presentation was really good, because we definitely need to, as part of our reinvestment strategy when we're doing street reconstruction, we don't just address the street surface, the driving surface, and the utilities underneath it. We also look at replacing sidewalks where they need to be, which will certainly increase mobility for some people. And I know the state's been spending a lot of money putting in the drop curbs for handicap accessibility and the tactile mats so that people with that are visually impaired can tell when they get to those intersections. So I think having that documented is really going to help us down the road.
Good. Now, the final one here is, what seems to be missing that you think it would be really good if you added this? Can anything pop in your mind and say, gee, we could use this, we could use that, or Johnson City could use this? We've tried to be comprehensive, but we don't claim to be covering it all.
I think I'd have to take a look at, as you mentioned before, we've really seen some new aspects to this site since the last time we met. I'd like an opportunity to sit down and go through it before I give you any feedback on it.
Fair enough.
I know you'd mentioned something there about the parking lots too.
Yes.
That's something that I would be interested in monitoring what they're going to do, how they're going to hook their, drainage systems into the existing systems too.
Yes, and I think we're going to keep going on the parking because we need to differentiate what's public and what's private.
Yeah.
Because UHS obviously
Right.
controls a lot of that.
'Cause that's a lot of impervious surface to deal with.
Exactly. And so there are other elements we want to look at, but we'll come back to you guys and say, okay, we're going to go out in the field. What else should we include when we go out there?
And parking is actually really important because, first of all, it's not a bad thing to have a parking issue because that means that there's a lot of people that are coming to the area that need places to park. So it's not a bad thing to have. But just in the case of the Sunrise development, they actually had to look at surrounding properties to enter into agreements for short-term and long-term parking because they couldn't meet the parking requirements on site.
I'm so glad you said that because when I was over there going through the building, I also counted the.
Right.
I'm just one of these crazy planner types. I had to count them, and it didn't seem to be up to snuff. What's your take on that?
Well, that happens frequently, and we ran into that issue a lot when I was at the city. And what we encourage property owners to do when they're coming into a redevelopment plan, and a perfect example is if you have a church that's next door to a commercial development or a residential development. Essentially, the parking load for a church is obviously on Sundays, depending on denomination and whatnot, but it's a limited use of the parking lot, which means that a lot of those spaces can be made available to commercial uses in the surrounding area during those off-peak times that the church doesn't need them. So we've encouraged developers to go out and talk to the adjoining property owners to find out if there is an opportunity for shared parking agreements.
Good.
And that seems to have worked pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah, because they're working with the railroad
Right.
to get additional parking.
Oh, okay. Excuse me. One of the things I'd like you guys to look at too is the interview with the imam because of the mosque there, and they've expanded. One of the things that he pointed out, among many other interesting things, and I know this from other religions, that the people who come to service there regularly want to live nearby the mosque.
Mm-hmm.
And so he sees not just an increase in the interest in commercial development, but related to, he thinks, more and more people who attend that are going to want to live in the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
So take a look and listen to that. I'd like to get your feedback on
Okay.
that as well. So thank you both very much. We really appreciate your time.
Sure.
And we wish you all the best.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right.